Welcome to Intelligent Investor Insights with Joshua Barone and Robert Barone, your co-hosts and guides through the noise of today's markets. Here, we interpret the data behind the headlines, break down what's driving the economy and interest rates, and help serious investors make decisions rooted in clarity, not emotion. If you're looking for disciplined, research-driven insight to strengthen your portfolio, you're in the right place.
Welcome back to Intelligent Investor Insights. I'm Josh Barone, here with my dad and resident macro skeptic, Dr. Bob Barone. Today we're breaking down Project Vault, Trump's new critical minerals stockpile, and what it means for commodity prices and miners.
Good to be here, Josh. And this is one of those topics where the headlines are noisy, but the underlying policy shift is actually enormous.
Let's rewind the tape. This all really starts in 2020. The pandemic hits, and suddenly the supposed magic of just-in-time, globalized supply chains turns into empty shelves and panicked hospital administrators.
Exactly. You had masks and basic PPE disappearing, pharmacies short on critical drugs, and high-tech manufacturers scrambling because key components just vanished. What we used to call efficiency, outsourcing production to the lowest cost foreign supplier, turned out to be a real national security vulnerability.
And to be clear, that wasn't just an inconvenience. Hospitals on the front lines literally didn't have gear. Pharma supply chains broke. Even advanced manufacturing, semis, electronics, started sputtering because inputs weren't available. That scar tissue is what Project Vault is reacting to.
Right. The lesson was simple. If you don't control the supply of essential materials, you don't control your own economy in a crisis. That's where the Trump administration shift comes in, moving from a pure efficiency mindset to one of resilience and economic security.
This wasn't out of the blue either. In his first term, you had Executive Order 13806, which was basically a full diagnostic on the manufacturing and defense industrial base. It exposed some pretty ugly dependency numbers in critical supply chains.
Then Executive Order 13953 in 2020 went further. It formally declared a national emergency over reliance on critical minerals from foreign adversaries. And the 2018 Critical Minerals Strategy quantified it, showing the U.S. was 100% import dependent on some minerals and over 50% on a long list of others, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, and so on.
So you had the diagnosis, too much reliance on foreign suppliers, especially adversarial ones, but no unified civilian stockpile yet. Those earlier moves planted the seeds, but they never built the big warehouse, so to speak.
Correct. Project Vault is the moment they finally build the warehouse. Think of it as turning that analysis into a full-blown national insurance policy, not just for the Pentagon, but for the broader industrial base, EVs, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and defense altogether.
And it's explicitly framed as economic security becoming core national security. We're no longer talking about a niche stockpile in a corner of the Defense Logistics Agency. We're talking about hardwiring resilience into entire supply chains for strategic materials.
And investors need to hear this clearly. When a government says, we will be a persistent buyer of a set of commodities for strategic reasons, that is not business as usual. That's the starting point for why this matters so much for miners and spot prices.
All right, so let's lay out what Project Vault actually is in practice. This isn't just a press release and a patriotic logo.
No, it's real money and real structure. At the core is what they're calling the U.S. Strategic Critical Minerals Reserve. It's backed by up to a $10 billion loan from the Export-Import Bank, plus roughly 1.7 to 2 billion in private sector capital layered on top.
So you're talking about, call it a roughly $12 billion program designed to build a national stockpile of critical minerals and materials. That's not trivial when you're focused on niche but strategically important markets.
And the scope is broad. We're not just talking about one commodity like oil. The stated intent is to cover essentially all minerals designated quote unquote critical by the US Geological Survey. That includes rare earths, the key battery metals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, uranium, copper, and other industrial inputs.
So, for listeners who invest in miners, that list should sound familiar. It's the backbone of EVs, grid scale batteries, wind and solar hardware, data centers, and the defense sector.
Structurally, Project Vault is set up as an independently governed public-private partnership. That matters. It's not a pure government warehouse that buys and forgets. It's integrated with commercial players via long-term offtake commitments with major manufacturers and traders.
Right. So think of manufacturers signing on to purchase and store material at agreed upon prices or formulas. They pay financing and storage costs, but in exchange, they get preferential access to that material when supply disruptions hit.
Exactly. That means the stockpile isn't just an emergency stash behind a locked door. It's part of the everyday supply chain. You can draw from it during stress, then replenish it later. It effectively becomes a revolving inventory tied to policy objectives.
Let's hit the goals clearly. First, reduce import dependence on risky suppliers, with China front and center given its dominance in refining and processing, especially for rare earths and key battery inputs.
Second, blunt the impact of export controls and price manipulation. We've already seen China use export restrictions on things like gallium, germanium, and magnet-related materials as a geopolitical lever. Project Vault is a counter lever.
Third, increase U.S. bargaining power in trade and security negotiations. If you're no longer structurally dependent on an adversary for the materials that power your fabs, your EV plants, your weapon systems, your negotiating position improves.
And I'd add a fourth, support the domestic critical minerals sector. When the government effectively guarantees there will be a policy-driven buyer in these markets, it changes the risk-reward calculus for new mining, refining, and recycling projects on US or allied soil.
So, from an investor's lens, you're looking at a structural shift. Critical minerals are no longer just industrial inputs, they're explicitly instruments of statecraft. And Project Vault is one of the main tools the US plans to use. Let's bring in the historical analogs because this isn't America's first rodeo with stockpiles. We've done this dance with oil and with defense materials.
Right. Start with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was born out of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, formally established in 1975. And it's still the world's largest emergency crude reserve.
And the big lesson there is that fill and draw decisions move prices. When the government steadily accumulated oil in a tight market, it added upward pressure. When they drew down, they could moderate prices, like the large 2022 release that helped temper gasoline prices, even if only temporarily.
Exactly. When a sovereign buyer steps into a commodity market at scale with strategic motives, spot prices respond. The SPR is a clear case study of that dynamic in oil.
Then you've got the National Defense Stockpile, which is even closer to what we're talking about with critical minerals. It started in 1939, expanded through the Cold War, and held materials like cobalt, chromium, titanium, manganese, industrial diamonds, even some pharmaceuticals.
At one point, The NDS inventories were worth over $1 billion. During accumulation phases, suppliers knew the US government was a committed buyer. They raised prices, and that buying pressure pushed certain materials higher.
Then, after the Cold War, Washington decided it was sitting on too much. They started liquidating and disposing of materials. That supply hitting the market depressed prices and changed trade flows, especially in things like titanium sponge and ferroalloys.
So you have a very clear pattern. Concentrated government buying tightens markets and supports higher prices. Large-scale selling does the opposite. That's your playbook for how policy-driven stockpiles interact with spot prices.
But Project Vault is different in scope. The SPR is just oil. The NDS was mostly defense-oriented. Vault is explicitly targeting what they call economic security materials, civilian and military value chains together.
Right. It's designed for a world where a lot of geopolitical competition plays out in semiconductor fabs, EV and battery plants, and data centers, not just on traditional battlefields. In that sense, Project Vault is the civilian industry counterpart and successor to the old stockpile mentality.
So if you're an investor thinking, we've seen this movie before, yes and no. The mechanism, big buyer, constrained supply, price impact, is the same. But the cast of commodities and the strategic context are very different.
And crucially, this time we're entering markets where supply is inherently slower to respond, where processing is heavily concentrated in China, and where policy risk is already elevated. That combination amplifies the price impact compared to a more liquid, diversified market like oil.
Let's talk mechanics. If you're holding or analyzing miners, what does a program like Project Vault actually do to spot prices and volatility in the near and medium term?
Start with the basics. You have a large policy-driven buyer entering markets where supply is relatively inelastic in the short run. Think rare earths, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and other specialty metals. It takes years to bring new mines and refineries online.
And on top of that, you've got Chinese dominance in refining and processing. So the bottleneck isn't just ore in the ground, it's the midstream, separation, refining, and conversion capacity.
Correct. Now drop a roughly $12 billion program into those markets. The US and its private partners are placing big orders, not because prices are cheap, but because they want security of supply. That demand hits relatively fixed short-run capacity.
So traders, industrial buyers, and the stockpile itself are suddenly all competing for the same limited output. To clear that market, prices have to move up. Producers will raise prices to ration scarce production.
And it's not just the actual tons bought. Expectations matter. When markets know that Washington wants a strategic reserve and has a giant EXIM credit line behind it, participants start to price in a higher, persistent layer of demand.
That shows up in the futures curves. You'd expect curves in some of these metals to steepen, with higher forward prices reflecting both the anticipated stockpile demand and the possibility of retaliatory policy from producers, export controls, quotas, and so on.
Speculators also join the party. A clear, politically backed program invites positioning in both spot and futures. That can sharpen price spikes when news hits, new purchase rounds, changes in export rules, or signs of geopolitical tension around these supply chains.
And the structure we talked about, the revolving stockpile, adds another layer. Companies pay carrying costs to hold inventory inside Vault in exchange for priority access in times of shortage. They're effectively locking in a long-term demand channel just to keep that option open.
Which means that Even in normal times, the stockpile plus its private partners function as a standing buyer. They're turning over inventory, drawing and replenishing. That supports a higher average price level over the cycle than you'd see in a purely market-driven regime.
There's also the spillover effect. If Project Vault tightens supply in rare earths, that feeds through to permanent magnets, which go into EV motors, wind turbines, robotics, precision weaponry. Same for lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper. Those feed into batteries and grid infrastructure.
So higher input prices can show up as higher costs for EVs and clean energy equipment, or as margin compression if manufacturers can't pass it all through. Some projects might get delayed or resized, which in turn feeds back into demand expectations and volatility.
Over time, yes, you can get material substitution, engineering around more abundant inputs, but that's slow, expensive, and uncertain. In the interim, we're looking at structurally higher and more volatile prices in a lot of these targeted commodities.
And embedded in those prices is a geopolitical risk premium. Markets are no longer just discounting geology and cost curves. They're discounting policy risk, export controls, and strategic stockpile moves on both sides.
All right, let's bring this home for investors. If you own or are evaluating miners in these spaces, what are the key implications of Project Vault?
First, higher and more durable price floors. When a large strategic buyer is present, the downside in many of these commodities is not what it used to be. That improves project economics for existing producers and for developers trying to finance new mines and refineries.
But it isn't a free lunch. With better economics comes more scrutiny. Projects tied to critical minerals face tighter environmental, social, and geopolitical risk. You're going to see more political interference, more permitting friction, and more pressure on where and how these resources are extracted.
Exactly. Investors can't just chase critical mineral tickers. You have to underwrite jurisdiction risk, regulatory risk, and counterparty risk very carefully. That's especially true if a company's growth story assumes tapping regions like Central Asia, Africa, or parts of Latin America.
On the industrial side, higher input costs can ripple through EVs, grid upgrades, and advanced manufacturing. That might slow some deployment at the margin or force manufacturers to eat more of the cost. Either way, it changes how you model downstream demand and margins.
Over a longer horizon, persistent price pressure might accelerate design shifts. Engineers looking for ways to reduce reliance on scarce or politically sensitive inputs. But as we said, that's a slow process. In the meantime, miners with the right assets and partners can benefit from the tighter, more politicized market.
Internationally, Project Vault is likely to intensify what's already being called a global race for critical minerals. Other countries may respond with their own stockpiles, export controls, and preferential supply agreements. That further securitizes commodity flows that used to be mostly about cost and efficiency.
And that securitization means mining is now squarely in the geopolitical crosshairs. For investors, that raises both opportunity and risk. You can see attractive upside in companies aligned with US and allied supply chain strategies. But you also have to be prepared for policy shocks.
From a portfolio construction standpoint, I'd say treat these miners as high beta expressions of a macro and policy thesis, not as sleepy income stocks. Position sizing, diversification across jurisdictions, and a clear view of balance sheet resilience are critical.
I'd add, don't forget cycles. Even with a strategic stockpile, you're still going to see booms and busts in these commodities. Policy doesn't eliminate volatility, it often amplifies it.
So to wrap it up, Project Vault marks the end of complacency about critical material supply chains. It structurally supports higher and more volatile prices, improves the case for selective miners, and embeds geopolitics into what used to be just industrial inputs.
And for investors who do the work, really understand the policy, the supply chains, and the jurisdictions, there will be opportunities, but you have to approach it with the same skepticism and discipline you'd use in any highly politicized sector.
We'll keep tracking how Project Vault evolves and what it actually buys as details emerge. For now, think of it as a structural regime shift in how the U.S. treats critical minerals.
And that regime shift will be with us for years, not months.
All right, Dad, thanks for walking through the macro side of this. And thanks to all of you for listening to Intelligent Investor Insights. I'm Josh Barone.
And I'm Bob Barone. Take care, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for joining Joshua and Robert on Intelligent Investor Insights. If today's discussion raised questions about your portfolio strategy, risk exposure, or how to navigate this late-cycle environment, we invite you to connect with us. We work directly with investors who want data-driven guidance, institutional-level analysis, and a partner in building durable wealth. Reach out to start the conversation and take the next step toward becoming a more informed, confident, and resilient investor. Until next time, stay rational, stay disciplined, and invest with intelligence.